Welcome to everyone here on behalf of Dignity in School.
Bienvenidos a todos.
This is a critical discussion on the need for increased supports for young people, including counselors that provide culturally relevant care rather than school hardening and police. We see how across the country schools have been divesting in social emotional supports, counselors, nurses, school social workers, and psychologists, but have invested in policing as a misguided and harmful tactic to make schools safe. With police presence in schools, young people, particularly Black and Brown and LGBTQ+ youth of color, are criminalized, arrested, pushed out of school, humiliated, and harassed at higher rates than their white peers. Even during emergency remote learning, Black and Brown young people are not safe from policing in their own homes. Grace, a 15-year-old Black girl in Michigan, was sent to juvenile detention for not doing her homework. A Black 7th grader, Isaiah, in Colorado, played with a Nerf gun during class and his school called the police. He was suspended for 5 days and received a documented record with the Paso County Sheriff's Office saying that he brought a firearm to school, even though it was a toy in his home. With continued racial injustice, the conversation about and movement towards police-free schools has been and continues to be imperative. As we are seeing major wins across the country for police-free schools, we also must make sure that policing doesn't show up in new ways. We can't merely replace officers with counselors, namely white women who make up a majority of the profession, who do not employ culturally relevant, responsive, and sustaining practices. This then becomes a new iteration of policing: psychological, mental, emotional, intellectual policing. This conversation and this workshop will delve into the need for and build the case for culturally relevant care. You'll hear from Dignity in Schools, who will ground us in the week of action. We'll dive into conversation with the featured panelists and then create space for breakout room small group discussion and strategy. And again, if you are just joining us, please do welcome Tilde, a language justice cooperative who will simultaneously interpret from English to Spanish during tonight's conversation. We're joined by Alexia and Moshte. Please also engage with us on social media. We're using the hashtags #DSCWOA2020 and #CounselorsNotCops to keep the conversation going. I would now like to introduce Zakia Sankara Jabbar to ground us in the Counselors Not Cops campaign and the week of action.
Greetings, everyone. Happy to be back with my DSC family for the annual DSC National Week of Action. This is like the 12th or 13th year, I think. So somebody can correct me if I'm wrong, but it's been going on for a minute. As many of you know, I am the former national field organizer until April of this year, and I moved on to another organization, but I'm still very much a part of the DSC family as a member through my organization that I co-founded, Racial Justice Now. So happy to be back again to be in this space with you all and to talk about the amazing work that Dignity in Schools continues to do across this nation to realize true equity and end criminalization for children of color, particularly Black and Brown students in America's schools. Thank you so much for setting that up, Sierra, as we have seen the unfortunate evolution of the school to prison pipeline with those two cases out of Michigan and the young man out in Colorado, where young people are being criminalized, unfortunately, even in a virtual environment. But to ground us in the vision of the Counselors Not Cops, I just think that we would be remiss not to point out that Dignity in Schools was the very first national organization in this country to come out against the regular presence of law enforcement in schools. The DSC staff, including Natalie Chapp, who I believe is the longest serving staff person, really worked over several years to bring the coalition together, to have conversations, to have meetings, to look at drafts of how we were going to frame this thing, because police out of schools, and right, like people are like, oh, excuse me, school shootings are still happening. But it was really rooted in the fact of the experiences of students themselves, and parents, even experiences of how law enforcement was really interacting with our kids in schools. And so obviously, as we know now, our coalition came together and voted in the spirit of removing the criminalization piece. We came up with the slogan, Counselors Not Cops, as a coalition to really just ground us in humanizing young people instead of seeing them as future criminals or seeing them as criminals themselves. And so, as you all know, it's a full list of policy recommendations. It is a model of how to avoid criminalization of students. It goes into great detail, looking at model policies, which was just updated this year, I believe, in early 2020, around fighting, dress code, bullying behavior. We're not running away from the things that are happening in schools, right? We know that kids have been kids. Kids are going to continue to be kids. What we are saying is that young people don't deserve to be criminalized for normal childhood behavior. So I was in high school. I didn't have cops when I was in high school, and I'm around 40 years old. So, cops, by and large, just the evolution of just the infiltration of police in schools is really a more recent phenomenon, right? And it's something that we're saying that is taking up a lot of our school districts' budgets in many places. And that's something that we can see as we argue for more resources for young people, especially now where we're looking at a virtual environment. There's 17 million children in this country who don't even have access to broadband, right? Why do we have districts who are continuing, even in a virtual environment, invest in a budget for SROs and security and all of those different things? So this is really a really critical time, and I think that we're in a time for DSC and other coalitions who are calling for the end of regular presence of law enforcement in schools to really put our feet on the gas. We've seen a lot of wins. Shout out to DSC member Black Organizing Project out in Oakland. Of course, Minneapolis set it all off with ending their contract with the Minneapolis Police Department after the murder of George Floyd. So I just want to just appreciate, DSC for leading this conversation, again, for being the first national organization to come out against ending the regular presence of law enforcement in schools. And also talk about the Week of Action is really a week that we use every single year. As I mentioned at the top, I believe we're in our 12th or 13th year of highlighting this issue of the school to prison pipeline. There's a lot of work that has been done over the last several years because of this campaign and because of all of our local members across the country. But as we see, there's still a lot of work that still needs to be done, which is why I believe we're here tonight to talk about not just Counselors Not Cops, right? We really have to also look at the anti-Blackness and racism that exists, unfortunately, in all institutions, including in the medical industry, including in counseling, including in all industries. So we have to begin to talk about culturally relevant practices, even when it comes to counseling, given the fact that Sierra mentioned that most of the counselors, like teachers in this country, are white women. So I don't want to take up too much space. I'll pause here, kick it back over to Sierra, and we can get into a fuller discussion. But thank you for allowing me to be here with you all.
Thank you so much, Zakia. You brought up so many great points. One, just celebrating and affirming the work of Dignity in Schools campaign and all of the members of Dignity in Schools campaign, as well as also situating us in a position where we are starting to think about, okay, there's still so much work to be done. And I appreciate you bringing up the budget aspect of this work, because we do believe that budgets are moral documents. And, you know, the saying goes, put your money where your mouth is. And we see where many schools are putting their money, and that's in policing and criminalization. So today we are joined by an esteemed panel of organizers and counselors. I'm really grateful to be in conversation with them today. And so to begin this conversation, I will invite each of the panelists to share their stories, share the stories of their work, and share the stories of what brings them to this specific conversation. And so I'm gonna start with Anais Kingsbury.
Good evening, everyone. I'm happy to join you here as part of this conversation. I'm a school psychologist with an elementary school, and I came to school psychology because I was looking to help support kids being successful in their education as a way of improving their life trajectories. So I think discussing counselors, not cops, and discussing potential criminalization of kids is in line with making sure that they're able to get as much as they can out of their education, recognizing that there's institutional racism and there are all sorts of like structural barriers to social economic mobility and fulfillment, but even taking that into consideration, trying to remove the obstacles that we can, like in our day-to-day, we can name and we can identify.
Thank you so much. I'd now like to introduce Arnice Robertson.
Greetings, everyone. I am Arnice Robertson. I am a licensed school counselor and also a 14-year veteran with Achieve Minneapolis as a career and college coordinator, doing the work side by side, school counselors for many, many years. And I think the thing that brings me to this work, or what brought me to this work, was really about giving young people and giving our scholars an opportunity to create a new narrative for themselves, to create an opportunity where they are changing their future, basically creating a new generational pathway for themselves, a pathway unlike anything, hopefully, that they've seen before in their families, or if they have seen certain things, carving a space where they can develop who they truly are, who they want to be. I've been working with career and college readiness for such a long time, and a lot of that work is about creating generational wealth. It is about creating a space where young people can be themselves. They are responsible handlers of power. We see in our day-to-day world when power is handled irresponsibly what that looks like. And so we want to, as school counselors, be advocates. We focus on the domains of the ASCA model, the American School Counselor Association model, that is the framework and foundation for our work, which focuses on young people and scholars as their academic lives and their social and emotional lives, as was mentioned in the introduction, as well as their college and career readiness, and marry all of those things together to help a young person sort of answer the question, who am I? And right now that's in question in our society right now. A lot of our young people, they don't know who they are. They know what they've been told, they know what they see, but really helping them to develop the answer for themselves. Who am I and where am I going? And as a school counselor, our role is to advocate for their best selves to come forward, and then to allow them a space to answer the question for themselves. Who am I and where am I going? And do I know how to get there? So I won't get too far down the road on my soapbox, but that is, a little bit of my story of what brings me to the work. And also, I just want to put it out there that I am a newbie to Dignity in Schools, and I am looking forward to some continued connection and longevity in the work. So if y'all will have me, put me to work.
Thank you so much, Arnice. I love this question that you pose, the question of who am I, right? Because that
Mhm.
gets at such a deeper part of self, but also of community, of family, of ancestry, of our connections and our relationship to land and to each other. So I really appreciate that. I'm still asking myself that question too. It's an important one.
Yes, as am I. And I'm seeing the note that I should slow down, so I'll remember that.
Thank you. I would now like to introduce Kate McDonough.
Hello, everyone. My name's Kate. My pronouns are they, them, theirs. I'm the Coalition Director for Dignity in Schools Campaign New York, which is the New York City chapter of DSC National. We are made up of over 20 New York City-based organizations that consist of youth, parents, educators, and organizers. So we're very much a multi-stakeholder organization. We've been fighting for police-free schools for a long time, and that's shown up in different ways. Particularly, one way is through our budget advocacy. So in the past, we have been able to successfully secure more funding for social workers in schools. We've been able to secure funding for restorative justice in schools. But we've also had setbacks. We've also had a hard time pushing and achieving the school that our members want, need, and deserve. And I would say, what personally brings me to this work, I'm from the Bronx. I grew up in the New York City public school system. As a young person, I was gender nonconforming for a good till about like 7th grade. And I do remember as early as kindergarten, having teachers tell my parents that something was wrong with me, that I needed counseling, that I had a gender identity disorder, and that, if it wasn't fixed now, horrible things would happen to me in the future. At the same time, they were also trying to skip me a grade, and there was this still, assumption that if we just fix this one thing, you'll be fine. So I very much see this, being almost pushed out for my the way in which I express my gender, but then being pushed back in for my white privilege, as I was one of the few white kids in class. What that experience does is really ground me in the need for this work to be centered in racial justice, where if we just focused on my experience, it would not actually bring us schools that we deserve. And lastly, I do believe that our school system can be a microcosm of the world that we want. And I believe that our members already have those answers, and that we can make it happen. I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Kate, and thank you for sharing that story with us, how important it is, and grounding how you show up to and for this work, but also in thinking about the future and what the future holds, and how we can create and sustain schools that are centered in joy and justice and love and equity. So appreciate that and appreciate you. Thank you. And I would like to introduce again Zakia back into the conversation to share some of your story as well.
Sure, absolutely. So yeah, I'm Zakia. I co-founded Racial Justice Now out of my experience as a parent, actually. When my son was 3 years old, he was already identified as a problem child, and I was threatened, that if I did not, force him to be in some kind of evaluation program, almost like similar, not necessarily similar, but it was like he was identified so young, like Kate, like so young, oh, there's something wrong with this child, he needs to be fixed. And if you don't fix him the way we want you to fix him, then we're going to expel him. That was my experience, right? And so I, as a parent, just intuitively knew something was wrong with that narrative about my baby, who was normal everywhere else, but just this school, right? He was fine before we entered this particular preschool. And so I'm looking forward to this conversation. I was actually excited to talk about this conversation because I do think, when we get into talking about like the ways in which sometimes counselors can also show up in harmful ways and act out in white supremacist ways because of this idea of anti-Blackness and always looking at Black people or some other kind of expression like Kate talked about, gender expression being pathologized, right? So his Blackness as a baby, 3 years old, was pathologized and something was wrong with him. And so we have to really dig into that when we're calling for counselors, not cops. We have to make sure we're not calling for counselors who will also look at the child and see a particular problem.
Thank you, Zakia. And I'm hearing so many things come up too, and just the stories that you are all sharing, and thinking about how sometimes counseling, policing, all of these aspects of policing, whether it's social emotional learning or the practice of counseling, it can show up really as forms of policing, of control, of trying to make folks conform to certain norms, right? And the question always comes up of whose norms and whose rules are we abiding to and abiding by. And I think about Bell Hooks calls it the imperialist, white supremacist, capitalist heteropatriarchy, right? And so when young people don't conform to this very specific way of being, of doing, rather than celebrating and uplifting and loving and affirming the ways, the many ways that they might show up at the intersections of their multiple identities, then it means that they are not valued. And we know that that's not true. So I'm really excited to dig into our conversation. This panel, as you all can see, has a breadth and depth of experiences to share multiple perspectives about the topic today. And so during our discussion, please do feel free to drop your questions in the chat box, and we'll try to answer as many as we can in the time that we have together. But just to kick us off, I have a question for the panelists, and I would love to dig into what role do you see counseling services playing in schools? What is the role of the counselor specifically in creating and sustaining schools that are safe? And I'll kick it to whoever would like to whoever feels moved and feels called to answer first.
All right, well, since I unmuted myself, I guess that means I'm going first. As far as the role that school counselors can play in helping to create and sustain safe schools, I think it's really important for counselors, as I mentioned before, to be advocates for so many things. Like we're advocating for pedagogy and what's happening in the classroom. And, I see so many counselors who walk around with this sort of position of, oh, I can't influence what's happening in the classroom because I'm not a teacher, which is not true, because in many ways, all of us are teachers. If you have gone through training and you have a license, you're a teacher, and you're in a school building and you are an influencer. Therefore, you are a teacher. But the specific role of school counselors, we have access to information that helps to sort of color what the student's experience is in the classroom. And so that can play itself out in a variety of different ways, right? And so we as school counselors, I think we have a responsibility to, oftentimes we know information about students. We know their background, we've met their parents, we've built relationships. And so those relationships help to color and influence information that we can then share with teachers, which then hopefully influences the classroom and the classroom setting and that sort of thing. We also have sort of the luxury, if you will, of not being in the classroom in the same capacity as a teacher. And so we become able to support teachers in a way that many other staff in our buildings cannot. And we tend to be the ones to ask the question instead of, you know, sometimes when a student is sort of acting out, if you will, you know, the teacher will say, well, go see the counselor and they'll help you, which in other words, what that means is they'll fix you. But that's far from the truth. And we then can ask the question, not what's wrong, but what happened? And I think that's a key question to be asking our young people: what happened, or what's going on with you, as opposed to just automatically jumping to the conclusion of, well, something's wrong, and therefore, as a counselor, I need to fix you, because that's not ever going to really happen. And so one of the things I think is most important in helping to create safe schools is creating an opportunity to build relationship. Relationship is probably the key answer to all of the questions about how do we create better. And you can put whatever you want to put behind better, but how do we create better? And the first and foremost place to start is with relationship. So I'll stop there because I want to give everybody a chance to chime in, but that's sort of my take on, you know, where do we begin in making schools safe places for students to really be and become. Every day we are becoming. The question is what? So whatever it is that our young people are becoming, building relationships so we can help them develop the answers to their questions, I think is the first step.
So I'll jump in. I'll say, you know, Ashe, amen, right? Our niece articulated, I think that so beautifully. You know, to the question, I think what counselors could be and what some counselors actually are, depending on what school district you're in, is completely different. The way counselors function in the schools that my children have attended, it's been more so them really doing paperwork for young people or identifying children who have disabilities, or doing more technical kind of work when it comes to looking at classes and, you know, what kind of track you will be on, you know, in your classes, not necessarily for that social emotional support and to help that school environment to feel safe. I think that is a goal, right? And I think that traditionally, when we think of counselors, we think, oh, wow, you have a school counselor, that's great. You know, things are wonderful. You have a school nurse, right? That's wonderful. But unfortunately, the way it operates in a lot of schools, most of the time they're very siloed. And I think, you know, our niece is right. Like, well, you know, some counselors are made to feel like, well, you're not the teacher. You know, the way we do things in this building, you have to always be with, or whatever the administration says. And so sometimes that doesn't always line up with what's in the best interest of the child. And I think that's what's important here as well. And it's a lot for parents to really figure out and navigate in terms of how they advocate best for their child. But I think for all of us here, the advocacy we can be doing is to ensure that our children have access to safety in schools, and that the school counselor, nurse, and other staff, including teachers, right, should be a part of that continuum of care, if you will, to steal, you know, some language from the medical field. It really should be an environment like that. And I think we have a long way to go. I think we have politics that are, you know, it's involved in that. We have state boards who are separate, who give licenses to the counselors. There's a separate state board who gives a license to a nurse. There's a completely different set of standards for teachers. Everything is so siloed, but we don't live siloed lives, right? We have to get to a point where everything is collective. And I think we just have a lot of work to do to tear down all of these very individualistic, kind of like silo, very really Eurocentric practices and policies.
As a practitioner in a public school, I view the public school as kind of like it's a resource. So even though within the school every child is important and their rights are important, I think a given classroom is a resource for all those students. And you have 1 to 2 teachers, they need to meet the needs of all the students. So unfortunately or fortunately, if you have a public school, that class is on one journey in each subject. And ideally every month, every trimester, the students are ideally on that same journey. So when you have individual students who are not on the path of the class, whether it's academically or social emotionally, that's kind of when the counselor comes in. As a school psychologist, I may be offering counseling, mental health services, but I may also be doing some evaluation to figure out, why is it that this scholar may not be on track with the rest of the class. But I think that it is important to, as much as possible, figure out a way to have have as many children together as possible. I think one of the challenges that I feel like teachers encounter is the idea that sometimes there's an overemphasis on one individual student when you have 30 students. So if one student, for example, is causing a distraction or is kind of detracting from the ability of the other students, then you have a whole system. So I think it's kind of like there's an extent to which I'm not a parent at this time, but there's an extent to which I think it would be helpful for people to view school as a public resource. So yes, a person is bringing their child in, but a number of parents are bringing their child in. So how can we work together to make sure that all children are reaching these goals? And sometimes that means an individual child or a group of children are attending a social skills group, or they're dealing with emotional regulation, or there's some assessments taking place in order to help everyone to be successful, like as a collective. I think sometimes individual supports and counseling actually, benefits and, helps the whole to thrive from a classroom perspective or a school-wide perspective.
I guess I'll just add in because, building off of the need for it to be a community effort, I mean, that's something that we at DSC New York have really pushed for, particularly through advocating for there to be restorative justice in schools, which is a practice that enables the school community to, develop their own values, create that system of care, and also be able to address harm when it does occur. But I think the important piece is school community. Young people and parents should be a part of this from the very beginning. Particularly in New York, the way it's being rolled out by our Department of Education is very top down. Young people and parents are not included from the beginning, and they really should be the ones shaping those values. We have lots of members who are in schools right now where the young people have a restorative justice club. They're the ones leading circles. They're the ones, bringing their schoolmates along and fostering this environment. And I think counseling is beyond just one person's job. It's not this clinical, something's happening with you, I need to send you to the counselor. It's really, I think when we're actually talking about this, it's wanting a loving school community that enables people to show up as whole people, that values them as whole people, and cares about that. And I think that's really what we're fighting for, is for our schools to be centered in love and care and community.
Thank you. I love that. I'm hearing this theme in all of the brilliance and the expertise that you all have shared about the importance of building strong individual relationships to really shape the power of the collective, and then leaning into communities to truly create a whole system of care using healing-centered supports so that the whole person, the whole young person, the whole family, the whole community can feel a sense of healing and also a sense of care that is really embedded in this school system that in many places is really the central point for us and for our work and where we go to, just as you all have shared, that it is a resource. And so I want to dig a little bit deeply into this question of what does culturally relevant care look like, but also what does it not look like? Sometimes we can talk about what it does look like, and then I know folks often have questions about, am I doing this right? Recognizing that it's not a checklist, it's an orientation to doing this work and creating this sense of care. So I'd love to hear from all of you. What does culturally relevant care look like, and what does it not look like?
I'll take a stab at this one really quickly, and I promise not to take up too much time. But I think culturally relevant care, for me, looks like, when it's done right, it looks like, the practitioner has done some work in understanding, and not just understanding, but really appreciating differences without pathologizing those differences as because they're different from a particular cultural norm that's of the majority, if that makes sense. And meaning that you've taken the time to see, young people, their history, their own culture, politically and socially, in who they are, not as less than, but as who they are, as full, human beings. And their culture is certainly not, bad just because it's different. Like, different doesn't mean deficient, right? Because I think many times when we see things, when we see other people and other cultures, different races, backgrounds, even linguistically, sometimes we can see that as a deficiency. And so I think as a practitioner, it's on the practitioner's part to make sure that if you're working in a school that is predominantly children of color and you're not of that particular community, and this could even go for geographically, like this could be people who are of the same race or same lineage even, right? We have huge immigrant populations. I'll give you a quick example. I'm African American, right? And I moved to suburban Washington, D.C., and I learned very quickly that there's other Black people who look just like me, but speak a completely different language. And it was a culture shock, because living in the DMV, there's Black people from the continent, there's Black people from the Caribbean, like there's everywhere. And to me, it was a beautiful thing to be immersed. And this was the first time I was actually, there's a sister that just started talking to me in Amharic, and I was just like, she said, "Oh, I'm so sorry, I thought you were Ethiopian. You look Ethiopian," right? So, even that, so for me, I feel like, for me, it's on me, right, to try to understand the cultural context and linguistic context of my fellow, Africans in the diaspora who may not be from America. I'm trying to make this make sense, but I don't see that happening a lot of times in our schools, particularly with counselors and even teachers. Many times we see different as deficient. And I think that is the fault of the curriculum, even at the collegiate level. Right? It culturally relevant. So many of the teachers that I've spoken to since I've been an organizer tell me they never had a course at all, right? In their entire teaching program. I don't know if that's true for counseling, but I don't know if they are even introduced to this. And here we are, we're in a country where the vast majority of the students are students of color. And it's only getting higher. So I think that this is a critical conversation in this moment, in this call for counselors, not cops, while we're, interested in getting rid of the immediate harm, which is the police. We also, and I appreciate DSC having this platform, but we also have to make sure that when we're moving to this new system of counselors, that we're doing our due diligence to call on counselors and social workers to make sure that they're not looking at differences as deficiencies and making errors in clinical observations, if that makes sense. And I'll say finally, what it looks like is just appreciating the vast, beautiful variations of the human experience. And making sure that even if they're working in a system that doesn't encourage that they're also being an activist in their own right in making sure that they're pushing back in a way that really centers the experiences of the children and the students and the families in the particular school and in that particular community, when systems and structures are set up in a way that are not serving, that's not serving that population well. So I'll leave it there.
Awesome. I just want to piggyback on what Sister Zakia had to say, in that I'm real fortunate. I'm gonna put this shameless plug out there. I'm real fortunate that I came from the University of Wisconsin River Falls, who our school counseling program does have that cultural diversity training, that equity and that lens as a part of our training as school counselors. I don't know if that's the case for all programs and counselors coming out of them, but I can put a plug in for my own training. But what I'll add to what she had to say also is that not only is it the responsibility of the practitioner to understand and look at the scholars that they are working with, but it also is their responsibility to take a self-look as well. Do some self-work and really understand who you are and what biases do you come with, and how do you show up. You know, I am very fortunate. I have been a practitioner in a school that is almost homogeneously African American. And so we have a variety of folks that work in the school building. And as you guys can probably imagine, that in a school setting with predominantly African American kids, is very few teachers of color who are teaching them. And so those of us who are a part of the counseling team, and we're also very fortunate that our counseling team is predominantly African American. So our students have the ability to see 2 or 3 or 4 people of color as school counselors right before them. You know, now before, you know, that's pre-COVID, but you know, now they just see us on the computer screen. But you know, we have to check ourselves and figure out, how do we show up? And so even our white staff, our assistant principal, our teachers and that sort of thing, you know, we have a really dynamic principal in our building who has encouraged all of us to take a look at ourselves. And if you think that you are coming across one way, spend some time with your peers, someone that you trust, and ask them, do I show up the way I think I show up? Because you may be thinking you're showing up one way and folks are behind your back going, no, they don't, you know what I mean? So it's important for you to do some self-work and then maybe ask the question, how are you showing up? And get some honest feedback, and then reflect on that feedback. And maybe you need to make some adjustments in how you are showing up in front of our scholars. The other thing is, I think people have this notion or misnotion of, if I'm a person of color, then I am automatically culturally competent, which is so not true. It is so not true. And we all have to do the work. Nobody is exempt from doing the work, because we all come with our own set of biases and our own experience. And whatever the case may be, no matter what cultural background, whatever situation that a student may come from, you bring your own baggage and your own sort of self-understanding of what that student may be dealing with. And so it's important for us to recognize that just because we may come from a marginalized, traditionally marginalized background, does not mean that we are now the authority on everyone's experience. And so we sometimes need to take a back seat and have several seats, and sit down and really do some self-reflection.
Just to add on to what's already been said, I view culturally relevant education as just avoiding assumptions about scholars and families. So learning about the scholar's personal life, speaking with their parents, and getting that background information rather than making assumptions and also clarifying assumptions. I've had parents say to me, oh, you know how we are within this community, or you know how that is. And I'm like, actually, I'm not from your background. I don't, either way, I still don't know how it is. Can you tell me what you mean? So that type of information. And then I think more from the teacher perspective, looking at the curriculum and what is being taught and the position that scholars are placed in, reading particular texts or having a particular approach, for example, to the history of this country, and kind of questioning that, or maybe thinking about a way that you can foster a critical lens within students rather than having them just passively receive information that they're being given in class.
And then just that, I want to second everything that everyone has said so far. I say to add on to that, I do see it as investing in a system that looks very different from what we have right now. I think the systems that currently exist are intentionally designed to be oppressive, are intentionally designed to be racist, homophobic, sexist, transphobic, and they're working as they're supposed to. And that doesn't mean that there aren't great people pushing against that system, but that's how it's designed. And I just to uplift too, when our members were thinking through what our next steps for our Police Free Schools campaign would be, we did a whole visions board around what would, pretend you were walking into a police free school, what would that look like? What would it feel like? Who has these positions? We got answers imagine if schools ran a co-op where ownership was seen equally, and everyone had an equal part in decision making. So youth, parents, teachers, counselors. There would be restorative justice coordinator positions. Some came up with a position for someone who's just responsible for thinking about the climate. School safety would be handled by the grandmothers in the neighborhood, or some of the things that came up. Schools could have peace centers where there were parents and students who would support around conflict resolution. So they're just want to uplift answers exist, and there are these visions of what schools could be, and in order to get there, it also needs to be invested in and funded, which would be my other answer is funding. Because right now, in New York City, we spend over $400 million on school policing alone. And yet we're cutting right now due to coronavirus. Teachers on our hiring freeze, counselors and social workers on our hiring freeze. So we see where the priorities are. And then again, bringing us back to hope, the answers are there. And I do believe that we can make it happen outside of the system if we need to.
Thank you all so much. I'm hearing some themes come up here of one, as practitioners asking those critical questions of ourselves, but also asking questions of young people, of families, of communities to better understand, and coming from a place of humility to even be able to understand and to be curious, to be appreciative, letting go of the need to control, to truly lean into the power and the beauty of relationship building. And as you all were sharing, I thought of this piece that came out in Ed Week a couple of days ago. And the piece basically shared that 81% of current educators identify themselves as anti-racist or abolitionist teachers. And so, of course, a lot of questions come up there, because if that were true, then the system or the school system would look a lot different than it currently looks like. And so as I think about culturally relevant care and everything that you all are sharing, I also think about, in anti-racism, we know what you're against, but what are you for, right? And so what are we for? We're for building all of the things that Kate has shared, that organizers have been dreaming and fighting for to put into existence. And so how do we all work together collectively as communities, educators, school staff, counselors, organizers to make these dreams a reality? Yeah, I appreciate that, y'all. And so I want to talk a little bit about the current moment here. And I would love to hear from you all. What does or what should counseling look like in remote environments?
Well, I'll start as a practitioner, a school counselor working in this current environment. And I will first say that it is definitely a work in progress. Um, every day we are learning, what is this thing supposed to look like? And we are in, and I've been saying this to a lot of people, that we are in an apocalyptic time. This is an epoch meaning we are forever different from this moment forward. Everything that we know about counseling, about school, about all of these things are different now as a result of these global pandemics. And I do mean plural pandemics. And so we can't continue to do what we have been doing. And so we have to be doing it differently. And we can't say, well, I can't wait to get back to normal, because normal wasn't working either. And so we have to create a new reality, a new way of doing the work. What we're experiencing right now is, everybody's online. And so we're doing these online one-on-ones, and we are also doing online small groups in a way that we've never done before. We all of a sudden, we are super competent in using Zoom and WebEx and Google Meets and every other virtual way of communicating with each other. And so I think that is an important piece of it, that we are learning to sort of evolve with the process or with the practices. But I also think it's important to remember that some things are constant. Some things remain real relevant. So as I mentioned earlier, relationships are important. Parents and families work together. And so it's important for us to not forget that our young people, our scholars, come from a system within their own families. And so we cannot leave out parents in the process. We can't leave out families in the process. And so we need to still be advocates. We need to still be, building and maintaining relationships. And we also know that if scholars are in situations where their home was already volatile, well, guess what? Now they're in that volatile situation all day, every day, when school was once their place of refuge. And so no longer is that place of refuge available. I mean, school has literally left the building. And so we have to evolve and be mindful and come up with new ways to connect, because otherwise our scholars may be lost. And so it's really important that we build those connections. And sometimes we got to go out and, go get them, make the personal phone calls and jump on their social media and, all of the different things that, traditionally we were told, oh, you can't be friends with kids on Facebook, or you can't have access to their Twitter accounts. Well, how else are we going to find them? I guess is my stance on it. And I think it's important to always remember to be appropriate in those settings, but we have to do what we need to do to connect to our young people, because if we don't, then who will? So I'll just leave that there.
Something that I think is important and a work in progress is trying to make counseling as dynamic as possible in the absence of a counseling space. So looking at ways to vary the medium used to present whatever the topic is, whether it's, use of a visual, that could be a poster, or maybe using a video, finding ways to do some sort of interactive games. Some counselors use physical activity, brief, like in short spurts. So finding ways to get kids moving and engaged so that they feel like there is a departure from their classroom. Because usually kids are happy to leave the classroom, even kids who like to learn. They're like, yeah, I get to go out, I want to play games, I want to, have a space, get together with other friends who I'm not usually with. So it's kind of figuring out how to make things feel as different as possible, how to create a separate space, even though it's virtual.
Yeah, I appreciate everything that you both have shared about what counseling can look like in emergency remote learning. I think that technology and opportunities to be together virtually, like this is a new, well, we are engaging in new ways, right? But it's a digital realm, and technology is created by people. And so how do we really take the power back from technology to truly center new ways of being, new ways of doing, but also continuing to build deep relationships with one another in that technology. And so recognizing that this is an ongoing fight to ensure that there's holistic safety in schools, what are the alternative spaces that we can craft to rely on ourselves and meet the needs of our people as we commit to institutional and structural change? What can we create? And I know, Kate, you've already forecasted some of this for us, so really excited to hear more.
Yeah, I mean, I think something I think about when we talk about creation is like anytime we gather in space. So even right now, it is a form of a political act because it's an opportunity to create the vision of the world that we want. So we try to do that at Dignity in Schools Campaign New York, like even virtually, which is a challenge. Going from having that in-person connection to like being on a screen together. We do work to have it be a reflection of the world that we want. So we, everyone, little things, everyone states their pronouns at the beginning so that we make sure that we're always respecting people's gender. We've just rolled out some youth leadership positions at DSC so that our young people can now like be paid for their participation as leaders there. I also want to give like a big shout out to our friends at Coalition for Educational Justice who are going to be launching their Liberation School soon. So they've fought really hard to get culturally relevant curriculum in New York City public schools, and then finally said, you know what, we have the answers, we're just going to do it ourselves. And so that's what they're doing, and definitely a big supporter of that, and something that we hope to be partners with them on that. And I also think, oh, hi Marika. I see you. And now I lost my thought. I got so excited to see Marika's face. Oh no, oh yes, defining our own terms of safety. So we created our own police-free schools policy guidelines that really outlines like what we mean when we say police-free schools. It redefines safety. It talks about the different types of jobs that could be held through this framework and have it be through a gender and racial economic justice framework. So it's there, and we're creating it right now. Like in this moment, anytime we're in space together, we're creating models for something that we want to see.
I just have to say, I really love what you had to say, Kate, and I think it's really important that we honor all of the participants of our community as great, reflecting their greatness and letting them know that we don't take their involvement for granted, because it's so important to have them help to have our scholars create what their future is going to look like, and then honor them, pay them for their work because it's valuable. We pay everybody else, so let's not pimp out our kids, but let's empower them. So thank you for that.
Thank you all for sharing those strategies and that dreaming about this world and what it could be. And so on the same lines, I want to take a little bit of time to focus some attention to the policies and the practice of this work. And so Anais and Arnis, I would love for you to share some strategies, some tools, some resources that you use in your own work to center culturally relevant practices and build relationships with young people and community. I know that there are a number of counselors that are joining us in conversation today, and so would love for you to share with all of us some of those tangible strategies and tools that you use in your work.
Well, I'll start it off because I kind of may not have a whole wealth to share, but I think professional development is key. So in the winter prior to the pandemic, I attended the Association of School Psychologists, and there were certain sessions that were focusing on interventions within counseling and just general mental health supports for people from underrepresented backgrounds, marginalized backgrounds. There's actually not as much research as we would like. So I think that's an area of need. So I was actually looking for curricula that specifically were appropriate for people of scholars of African descent. And there's maybe 2 or 3, I think, that are in existence. Someone please correct me if I'm wrong. So then the one session I went to, the 2 PhD students had adapted it, and they were talking about the adaptations they made. So I think I kind of see our role at this point in time as like creating tools. So actually, in order to really provide culturally relevant mental health supports, there needs to be curricula, there needs to be implementation, people need to try out strategies. And I think because of the kind of white male, heteronormative, middle class ideals that dominate mostly everything, there's not, this is an area of development that needs to be explored.
I definitely have to echo what Anais is saying. There is just not enough curriculum out there that has been developed. I talked about this extensively when I was a graduate student, and I was like, okay, we need to do the research. And my advisor would say, wow, Arnis, that sounds like you're headed toward a dissertation topic. Y'all trying to kill me. No, but seriously, there definitely is a need for more culturally relevant development of curriculum. There's not enough out there. But what I will say that, you know, I'm in a really amazing school right now where, you know, our principal, I mentioned her before, Mari Friesleben is her name, and she's doing some really dynamic things. One of the things that we just did recently was we had the entire school to pause, and everybody watched a documentary together during the school time. It was the documentary Black Boys, and the entire staff, including every custodian, every dean, every security person, our assistant principal, the clerks in the main office, like the whole school shut down and joined in a small group, if you will, to watch the movie and then have dialogue, where we encouraged our young people to talk and share their experience, tell their story, tell their truth. How do they see themselves show up in what they saw in that movie? It was so powerful. It was amazing, because so rarely are our scholars given an opportunity to just reflect. You know, we put them in a situation all the time where we give them information, we expect them to perform and move on. And we don't ask them, how does this affect you? What does this mean for you? And how can I be better as a result of hearing your story, hearing your experience? And so I think that's one of the things or practices that we can do, is spend some time giving students the microphone, if you will. Give students the mic so that they can talk, because one, we don't give it to them enough, and therefore we are doing them a disservice if we're not giving them an opportunity to express themselves and for us to learn from each other. You know, there's that statement of iron sharpens iron. Our young people need to be able to, you know, be the sounding board for each other, and for the adults sitting before them. So many of the staff learned some things, and it caused them to reflect. It caused all of us to sort of reflect and say, where do I see myself in this situation? So that's one of the takeaways that I took from that. And so I would say my two main things is we need to develop more curriculum, especially for high school age students. There's all kinds of research out there for elementary and middle school, but there's just not enough out there for our high school scholars. And so there's room. And even though my professor was saying, Arnice, you should develop a PhD strategy, I will. I'm just not ready yet, but I will. And so I'm putting it out there in the universe. Y'all help me. Calling on the ancestors for this one. But yeah, there's definitely room for more work, more curriculum development.
I would also advocate for maybe more non-traditional routes, because I think because if you're in education, you're already in academics, so you're thinking, and we're pushed to like, we need to enroll in a program, then we need to make a proposal, we need to go through the internal review board, then we need to do like 3 studies and all this stuff, and this is like 20 years and we still don't have a, like, where's the curriculum? So I'm just thinking, I mean, is there a way for people to like publish an article, and then like people can use that article, or maybe come up with like some guiding principles, and people can use that along with their expertise, along with other strategies, so that like we have some works in progress, so that we can kind of bridge that divide between academics and practitioners. I think it's huge, and I think sometimes the goals are different as well. So like, how can we have, you know, like research that is helping in real time?
Absolutely. I'm noticing in the chat that there's some suggestions being placed there. Diana Freeland Foster is suggesting the Teaching for Change materials. I'm not sure if there's some other ones there, but that's what's popping out right now.
Yeah. And I appreciate what you both have shared about the need for additional resources that are culturally relevant, responsive, and sustaining. And Diana, I'm really grateful that you brought up Teaching for Change, because I have Teaching for Black Lives, which sits on my desk. It's an incredible resource of publication by Rethinking Schools. It has a number of lessons in here, but also stories, teacher stories about how this work what actually does this work look like in practice. It has some really illustrative lessons in here. In addition to Teaching for Black Lives Matter at School Week of Action has a whole Google folder of curricular materials, which I use as an educator. I'll be in there grabbing Google Slides and teaching ideas. So I'm going to put that in the chat box for everyone as well, just to share that. They've moved this year to a year of purpose because this work is ongoing. And so how do we show up for Black and Brown students every single day in classrooms, in the school building, but also in communities? And then lastly, I'll just share too, Teaching for Change. We are in the middle of Teach Central America Week. And so we have a number of lessons and curricula on our website that teaches about Central American figures and poetry, so that students, young people, can really see themselves reflected in the curriculum. So I'm really grateful to you all for bringing up the importance and the need for curriculum that is really relevant to young people and their communities' lives and their lived experiences. Awesome. So Kate, I'd like to turn to you now and invite you to share some of your reflections about organizing for counselors, not cops. What policies should we be following closely? I know you've mentioned funding is huge. So how can we truly advance policy that centers holistic safety?
Yeah. Well, we're just coming off of like a heartbreaking budget fight, where the city council passed their budget back in, well, on July 1st, the last possible day they could pass the budget. I think one thing to look out for is, as cities start to say like we are removing police from schools, is we're removing but not really issue that can come up. So for example, in New York City, all school safety agents are employees of the NYPD, and we have more school safety agents than we have guidance counselors and social workers. And there's about around 5,500 school safety agents in our city. And recently, in this last budget fight, the council voted to move the school safety agents from NYPD over to DOE, which we did come out against, because our argument was that you can't just simply shuffle positions around, that really what you need to do with that over $400 million budget is completely redesign how you think about school safety and create entirely new positions that are centered in youth, parent, and educator visions of like what safety is for our schools. And we would define it as like centered in restorative justice and liberation. Want to be careful of that because not everyone would define it the same way. So I think that is one thing to look out for, because I have seen that come up with my counterparts in other cities, where they'll say we're removing police from schools, but we're going to replace them with security, private security, or it's getting shuffled from one agency to the next. So that's one thing to look out for. Another thing that we fought really hard for in New York too is to get restorative justice in schools. So we did win a commitment to have citywide restorative justice for all middle and high school students, and social emotional learning for elementary age students. But there was no funding attached to that. So now, particularly with the pandemic, a lot of that work is in limbo, or the expansion is in limbo. And there's also how that actually happens is all in the details. So as I mentioned before, the way it's being rolled out is a very top-down structure. So our Department of Education has like a citywide restorative justice person who has coordinators who oversee like 20 schools, instead of working from the bottom up, which is a lot of like how restorative justice really took root in schools that started it before it was even this buzzword that it is today. I think those are like the key things I would look out for. So it's like your wins aren't always the wins that you want. And we have to be careful with that. And I think we are getting to a point where, at least as a coalition, we're thinking, how do we continue to create something outside of a system that will always self-correct, that will always, like, we'll get a win and then they'll always self-correct it to fit this like racist heteronormative framework, regardless of who's in the room. Because this doesn't mean that there aren't people within that system that are trying to push against it, but it will always find a way to self-correct. So how do we create something that breaks that cycle?
Thank you so much, Kate. And I know that Dignity in Schools has been leading a lot of the restorative and transformative justice work. And so for folks that are joining us on the call, can you just share a little bit about restorative justice and what it should look like, right? Because in many places it is co-opted and used as a weapon to shame young people. And so what does it look like when we do restorative justice practices well?
Yeah. So when it's done well, it will actually look different for each community because it's created by the community for the community that's developing it. It's seen as a practice and as a value system. So what I will have seen in places where it's just seen as like this alternative to suspensions, it's like, we had kids sit in a circle and we tried to do, this restorative justice thing and then it didn't work. Instead of really committing to it as this relationship building practice, as this way of creating shared values within your community. And I'd say that youth and parents need to be involved in it from the very beginning. You shouldn't be creating something for the school community without the school community, which I see happening. It's this very top down. So what that could look like is young people are the restorative justice practitioners in your school. Some schools have clubs where young people learn more about restorative justice and figure out how to have that be a part of their school community. I know some schools work with, we have one of our member orgs works with a school and they provide stipends for young people to be the restorative justice practitioners in their schools. So there's lots of different models, but I think what rings true is that it's centered in that community, and those who are going to be directly impacted by it are the ones that are shaping it.
Thank you so much. And thank you to all of the panelists. I know my mind is whirring with ideas and just thoughts and all of the synergy and all of the connection. And so we want to take a little bit of time for folks who are joining the call to have an opportunity to synergize, to strategize, and share resources, recognizing that there is so much collective expertise and experience in this virtual room. And so we're going to go into breakout rooms for about 10 minutes. And if you need interpretation, you can just stay right here with us in the main room. Each person in the breakout room should share their name, pronouns, and location. And there are 2 guiding questions for conversation. So 1, what sparks come up for you from what the panelists shared, and how might you apply any of this learning to your work? And then 2, what resources might you want to share with the group? I'm going to share a slide deck in the chat box where you can collectively put your thoughts. That way, everyone that has access to the wealth of knowledge in this group. The groups are numbered. You'll see it at the top of your Zoom room when we break out into breakout rooms, and those numbers will determine what slide you will use to take your notes. So I'll drop this in the chat box here, and I will also place the questions that I've just asked. So for 10 minutes, we'll have an opportunity to chat, to synergize, ask questions, and talk about sparks and apply it to our work. When we come back, yeah.
No, go ahead.
Go ahead, Safari. No, I was just going to say, when we come back, we'll have an opportunity to share those resources and share the sparks with the whole group as we come back together.
Yes, no, thank you for that. So no, the only thing I was gonna say in continuing with what you were saying is that Lakita is going to be putting the breakout rooms together. So momentarily, you should see a invitation to move to a breakout room with those rooms, and we'll be in there for a short time, as Sarah alluded to. Feel free to populate that presentation with notes in your corresponding group. And then also another reminder that if you do need interpretation, that there will be, the main room will serve as a breakout room for our folks that do need Spanish interpretation. So.
All right, folks, welcome back. I hope that you had robust conversations, shared resources, shared some strategy. And so I'd love to take a couple of minutes here just to open it up to see if there were any sparks, any resources, or any parts of the conversation that you would like to bring to the whole group.
Hi, this is Saida from Kofi in Chicago. First, I wanted to say thank you to all the panelists. I was extremely moved and inspired by everything you all had to share. I'm a young organizer, and I'm even more so a young organizer with Kofi in Illinois, but I know that one of the things that really drew me to this work and that I value about the organization that I'm joining now is they ran parent peace centers in Chicago public schools that I think continues to be a huge vision. We just finished our Week of Action event on Saturday, and it was statewide. So really, like, parents from across Illinois were like, peace centers, great. How do we get them here? Can we do it tomorrow? And just so much energy that like flowed into this panel. And for me, honestly, it was really inspirational to hear you all speak from an educator standpoint and from, like, people working in the schools, because I think one of the biggest challenges we face as we're having these conversations with our parents is like the continuous barrier of schools being defensive about parents being involved and bringing these practices into schools. So as an organizer, I thank you because it gives me a vision and like at least a tool to say, like, what we're asking for is not like out of the blue. There's people in your field who are already doing this work. So listen to us and listen to them if like listening to us is not enough, So I want to thank you all for that, because I don't think I have gotten to interact with in a lot of spaces with educators that have the same vision that you all have. So I really appreciate that from you tonight.
Thank you so much for sharing that, how important it is that we all come together, educators, organizers, to collectively strategize and synergize in this work. I've put in the chat box a link to Kofi's work. So good to see you, Aida.
Thank you, Sarah. And yeah, I should have linked something, but it's a great organization, y'all. I'm 2 months in, still learning about it, but I've fallen in love completely and feel so grounded about doing this work in my hometown.
Thank you. Appreciate the work that you do. Are there any other sparks or strategy or resources that anyone might want to share with a collective group? You could also put it in the chat box too if you don't want to come off of mute.
So this is Liz. So again, like everyone said, it's really great to be in the conversation with people who are actually in the school and using their professional status to make some changes, right? So one thing I'm thinking about every time we have these conversations is the organizing is good, but it's taking so long. It's like, it seems like it's a constant tussle, and I'm about ready to go. Like, okay, we need to have our own school. Like at least even starting out with like a kind of a Saturday school. I know many other cultures do that. The Chinese, the Russians, the Polish. They have their own school where they're teaching their young people about culture and language and so on, history. And so I was saying to Kate, like, I don't feel like qualified because I'm not an educator, but, and I know I definitely have to come up with a different name besides something with school. So, but that's the spark, right? How do we take it into our own hands rather than waiting for the system to adjust?
Thank you so much, Liz. What a powerful and important point of what do we create and how do we take care of one another, take care of our communities in a system that doesn't do a good job of always taking care of us, and then continuing to dream, continuing to power forward as we fight structural and systemic racism and homophobia and all of the isms and all of the forms of oppression. Yeah, what do we build now while we're still working towards a better future? Awesome. Maybe one more person that would like to share a spark or a resource or strategy.
One thing that was shared in our group 2, was the idea of informing parents of the possibility and the benefits of culturally relevant education, and encouraging them to advocate for that within their own school, within their children's schools.
Yeah, absolutely. How important it is that we also bring parents into this work. And so shout out to all of the parent organizers that are advocating and are asking those tough questions and are learning and continuing to lean into the school system so that the school system does provide the care that young people need. Yeah. Awesome. Thank you all so much for sharing. Great sparks, great strategy, just important reflections on this work. And so as we get ready to wrap for the evening, just wanting to say thank you to the panelists, to Kate, Anais, Arnice, and Zakia. Thank you to everyone who joined us this evening in conversation. Thank you to Moshte and Alexia and Tilde for interpreting. We appreciate you. And thank you to DSC for creating this space for us to come together and for all that you do this week of action and beyond. Y'all are really just incredible, and we are so fortunate to be able to work together, and so grateful for the work that you move in this world. And so tonight there were some major themes that came out of the conversation about culturally relevant care. This work is about deep relationship building. It's not about the what's wrong, but rather what happened, as Arnie shared with us, and building relationships to see how do we create better. Every day we are becoming better. And so how do we actually live up to that? As we talked about culturally relevant care, Zakia said, culturally relevant care looks like practitioners have done some work in understanding and appreciating differences without pathologizing those differences because they don't align with dominant culture. Different is not deficient, but how do we rather appreciate the vast, beautiful variations of the human experience? And I shared that culturally relevant care is avoiding assumptions about scholars and families. Kate shared that it's about investing in systems that don't yet exist. And so all of us tonight, we are charged with the important work of continuing to build relationships with families and communities for holistic safety so that we can build and we can sustain the world that we all deserve to live in. Thank you all so much for joining us. Please do keep joining during the week of action. Parent listening session tomorrow from 7 to 8:30 p.m. National Movie Night, October 9th, 6 to 8:30 p.m. on Push Out, which is an incredible documentary and a great book. So please, please, please join. And then Poetry for the People, Counselors Not Cops edition on October 10th. Thank you all so much for joining us, and I look forward to more opportunities to share space and to strategize.